Let's open with prayer. Amen. We're on page 6 of your notes, subtitled Islam held in check 4 times before the close of probation. In our last presentation, we spoke about this indignation or this punishment which is being represented in Revelation 7 by these 4 winds. We saw that the 4 winds were a symbol of natural and political strife. We then went to Ezekiel 9 and we saw that Revelation was the same sealing as brought to view in Ezekiel 9. But in Ezekiel 9, this sealing is focused upon the work that's happening in God's church. It's an internal work that's being discussed there. We saw how we could lay Ezekiel 9 beginning at 9:11 and running all the way through to the 3rd angel's message where God's people would be sealed, and it gives the language that many of God's people would be killed with these slaughter weapons, which was the message that had been given from this point onward at 9:11. We spoke about that. We've spoken about the judgment of the living. Here these people's names are being called up in the book of life and they are still alive. This process where they are sealed began at the beginning of the sealing at the 1st angel's message, which is why we mark that we're now in the period of the judgment of the living. We've transferred from the judgment of the dead to the judgment of the living. We then went on to Luke 21 verse 25, and we saw that the historical fulfillment of Luke 21:25, the distress of nations, was the distress that the European nations had in the year 1840 when radical Islam was restrained. We saw that there's a parallel passage in Revelation 11 where the nations are no longer distressed, but that they're angry. Now they actually go to war against radical Islam, and we've been witness to that for the last 15 years. At least, it goes further back than that, and we saw that today the West is in a life and death struggle with radical Islam. There's much, much more that we could talk about radical Islam, but we left it at that stage because our focus is upon this sealing. And now we've got to Early Writings 38, paragraph 1. And this is why it's been subtitled that Islam's held in check. So Islam are these winds of strife that we already said before that are held in check. And you remember when we drew this line which had these 3 groups of people in them, and we saw how each group was individually sealed and then the winds would be let loose. But we also saw how you could see that if this group was sealed here, and then this group was sealed here, and then this one, so you'd have the first, second and last stage of this sealing process, that these winds would begin to be loose progressively as each group was sealed. So this is the concept or the idea behind this subtitle, Islam held in check or restrained 4 times before the close of probation. I saw 4 angels who had a work to do on the earth and were on their way to accomplish it. Jesus was clothed with priestly garments. He gazed in pity on the remnant, then raised his hands and with a voice of deep pity cried, "My blood, Father, my blood, my blood, my blood. So here's this phrase of my blood mentioned 4 times, which is dealing with the safety of God's people. Remember, we spoke about the model, the story of Moses, where the blood was applied upon the door, and it was the blood that kept you safe, that you could retreat into the place of safety, into your chamber. So this blood that's been mentioned here, these 4 bloods, is the restraining of Islam, where God's church is going to be kept safe. That's why it's mentioned 4 times. Then I saw an exceeding bright light come from God, who sat upon the great white throne, and was shed all about Jesus. Then I saw an angel with a commission from Jesus, swiftly flying to the 4 angels who had a work to do on the earth, and waving something up and down in his hand, and crying with a loud voice, "Hold, hold, 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 until the servants of God are sealed in their foreheads." So this is a parallel passage to Revelation 7, dealing with these 4 winds, these angels that are restraining these winds. They were about to let the winds loose. They had a work to do upon the earth, which was going to occur in this time period here before the sealing. God looked upon his people, saw that they were not sealed, and sent a commission to these angels not to do the work of destruction that he had sent them to do, but that they were to restrain the elements of nature and political strife so that God's people could be sealed. And we've diagrammed all of that here. And we also want to pick up the point to see that it's going to happen in a progressive stage. So I know there are people here who are not fully au fait with all the waymarks of our message, and I'm also cognizant of the fact that Brother Patrick hasn't developed all of our line to the fullest extent. So I'm going to have to sort of skip ahead, and hopefully either you can ask that this weekend for us to clarify some of the issues that I'm going to bring to view now, or you can go online and find presentations that address this issue, or you may be already familiar with it. A combination of any one of those. So I'm going to draw our line now in a more comprehensive fashion than I've done before. So I'm going to be putting 6 waymarks on here. So we have 6 waymarks, and it's going to begin with 1989, the waymark that we have here. And do recognise that Brother Patrick still has to lay out all the logic to define why we're going to pick these 2 events, 1989 and 9/11. He still has that work to do, even though I began to put together at least a piece of logic based upon testimonies to ministers, what we've got here, that could show you that it has to be at 9/11. But he's going to develop this point in a lot more detail. So we've got 1989 and 9/11. Now in this message, in fact even in Ellen White's writings, you get certain themes. And there's one way of describing the theme that is being discussed in our history. I'll give you 2 themes. One of the themes is the theme of marriage. And the other theme is the theme of the church. These are the 2 themes that we spend a lot of time conceptualizing when we develop a framework of this message. There's going to be a marriage, there's going to be a church, and then afterwards there's going to be this punishment. So when we think about this work of these 3 angels and the sealing time period, we can do so in a framework of marriage, or we can do it in a framework of a church. And when I mean a church, what I'm thinking about in my mind is a building. There's this building that's being constructed. And the reason why we focus a lot on this construction of this church or this building is because if you go back to Millerite history, I'm not sure if Brother Patrick mentioned this, he may have done it, and it just may have slipped my mind, that he gave you the date 1798 to 1844. And again, if you do some calculations, you know that the time span between these two periods is 46 years. And this number 46 then becomes a symbol of Bible prophecy, because you can trace this symbol all the way back thousands of years to a conversation that Christ has with the leadership of the church in John chapter 2, verse 20. In John 2:20, it speaks about the time period in AD 28. Brother Patrick did mention this, that this is 6 months after his ministry, and now he's got 3 years of ministry left. So if I just put that here, this is the 3.5 years of Christ's ministry. Here's the first 6 months, and then he's got 3 years after that. And he mentioned these 3 steps, this first, second and third step, and he intimated that this was a reference back to the 3 angels' messages, and it is. But in John chapter 2 verse 20, we're just here. This is AD 28 in the spring. He's going to clean the temple for the first time. And he gets into an argument or a fight with the leadership of the church. And they ask him, by what authority do you have to come into our church, not yours, our church, and do what you're doing? And Christ responds back to them is in a classic way that he does, with this. Let's read the passage instead of me trying to paraphrase it. It's far easier. So we pick up from verse 18. John chapter 2 verse 18. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? We want a sign that you have the authority to come into our building and do what you're doing. This is the sign that they're asking for, because he's just cleared the temple court of all their profanation, all their buying and selling, and they say you've got no authority, no right to come and do this. Even though he gave them plenty of evidence, because divinity flashes through humanity when he does this, and they're all scared of him. And if they weren't scared of him, they would have just sent the officers, the guards, just to restrain Jesus, and they would have carried on. How can a singular man get all of these people to listen to him? So they already know that they've received a sign. Verse 19, Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. This is the sign that he's going to give them. He says, you are going to destroy this temple, and I am going to rebuild this temple in 3 days. And their answer to this is, Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it in 3 days? And then verse 21 talks about, he's not talking about the literal temple, he's talking about his own body. But there's much more to this passage than the 3 days that he's in the grave, a lot more than that. So Christ is talking about a temple, and this temple in the New Testament becomes a symbol of the building up of a church. And what Christ is saying to them is this: you, the leadership of the church, have destroyed this church by your behavior and your conduct, and it's symbolized by your behavior in the temple. So when he says that you have destroyed the temple, he says, you have destroyed this church, and I'm going to build a new church, and my new church will be built in 3 days. Now we all understand about a day for a year principle, and this is AD 28, the spring, the Passover, and 3 years later, the first, second and third year later, this is the fourth Passover, and this is where Jesus is going to be crucified. By the time you get to the spring of AD 31, the church, Christ's church, his temple has been built. It took him 3 years to build that church. It starts off with the 12 disciples, starts off with 5, and then it builds up, and by the time you get to the cross, the church is already being established. And this is only in the midst of the 70th week. You've got another 3.5 years. And who does the work in these 3.5 years? It's the disciples. And who are the disciples? They're nothing more than the church. You have to have had a church in place for the work to have continued when Christ died. So you can see why Christ says, in 3 years I'm going to build my church. Then he knows he's going to die, and this church is going to continue from strength to strength. This church is the church of Ephesus. When you start thinking about the churches as you run through New Testament history. But this church has been built and is ready to do its work 3 years after this conversation. And it says in the passage that it took 46 years to build this church that they have now destroyed. So that's the relationship between the 46 years and the 3 years that Christ is talking about. Christ is talking about the church that he has built. And remember, the church is nothing more than his body. We know that. These are all terms that we're familiar with. So this 46 years, which is connected to a temple building, then becomes a symbol of a temple building at the end of the world, at the time of the end. And that's why this 46 years is dealing with the building up of a church or a temple. Hence, part of the symbol that we have when we think about end time prophecy is the building up of a church or a temple or a building. So that's where that model comes from. And the other model that we talk about often is the model of marriage. So we get the model of marriage from this same parable that we've just referred back to here, Matthew 25, the parable of the 10 virgins. The parable of the 10 virgins is a story about marriage. This issue about marriage comes up over and over again. Now, we spoke in a previous presentation about the book of Esther. The book of Esther is nothing more than a love story about people getting married and people getting divorced. Now, let's think about this. Christ says that you are going to destroy a temple. That temple is a church. A church is symbolized also in Scripture by a woman. Now, the destruction of a woman or a wife is the divorcement between a husband and a wife. So in the book of Esther, when this woman is divorced from her husband, King Ahasuerus, it's a symbol of the destruction of the church that's been brought to view in John chapter 2, verse 20. But in that same book, there's another woman who marries this same king, who is Esther. And Esther becomes a symbol of a church that's now going to be built. First she's purified and then she's married. So the symbol of a marriage, which is the union of a human being with Christ, becomes the same symbol as the construction or a building of a church. Because to build a church, what do you have to have first? You have to have a foundation. And this foundation is nothing more than Christ. So you have the union of a building with the foundation, Christ and his people, a marriage, a husband and wife, Christ and his people. They're just different symbols of the same thing. So when we think about this marriage, we often think in the terms of Matthew 25. Ellen White focuses a lot on Matthew 25 when she thinks about or discusses end time prophecy and Millerite history. We pick up terms from that parable. So one of the strongest terms that we pick up from that parable is that there's a cry made at midnight. All of us are familiar with this, the midnight cry. You've heard it mentioned in many sermons. You've read Ellen White repeatedly talk about this, especially when she focuses on Millerite history. Now we are going to demonstrate, we've already inferred, that Millerite history is a type of the history of the end of the world. And this concept of the parable of the 10 virgins of Matthew 25 is a central theme. It's one of the core components of their message. The Millerites, by the time they got halfway into their reform line, not halfway in time span, but if this was their reform line, when they're well into it, they realize one thing, that the story of Matthew 25 is not some theoretical story about some Jews who lived 2,000 years ago. They personify those virgins and they become those virgins. They take those virgins and they enter into that experience. They recognize that they themselves are a living fulfillment of that prophecy. And once they come to that realization, it takes them a long while to do that, the whole ministry or that whole movement changes when they realize that that parable is being fulfilled right before their eyes by people who are living amongst them. Now, when we look back at that history from a distance, we're 170 years in the future, and we look back, we really calmly take some of those men and we name them and say, this person had this role and this person had another role. But what I want to do is pick up some phrases from that parable, and the first one I want to pick up is midnight. So here's midnight, and this is taken straight from the parable. Now, this concept or waymark of midnight occurs many, many times in the scriptures. If you did a study on the midnight, what we teach using this methodology is the following. Matthew 25 says at midnight there was a cry made. So here's midnight. This is Matthew 25. Now in the story of Moses, even though Brother Patrick didn't focus on this, that angel of death comes when? At midnight. So now you've got the story of Moses. And if we're going to do this line upon line methodology, you can begin to see the reasoning behind how you take different stories from Scripture and you begin to line them up really carefully. So you can begin to line up these stories by these key phrases. Sometimes it's an individual word, sometimes it's a phrase, sometimes it's a concept. And so we're going to take these things and you can run them all the way through. But we're taking this phrase midnight from the parable of the 10 virgins, and we're going to say that it's going to be a waymark in our history. The reason why we say that is because it was a waymark in Millerite history. Now, if you were to do a surface reading of Matthew 25, it says that at midnight there was a cry made. So what you would instinctively do, most people would, in fact we did this for a long time in this movement, we'd say, here's 1798, and here's a number of other waymarks. So this is the arrival of the first. I'll put in here the empowerment of the first. This is 1840. This is April 1844. This would be the arrival of the second angel. And then right here, the midnight cry. And here is October 22nd, 44. The third angel's message arrives. So here's the midnight cry in the Millerite movement. And they recognize this as occurring in their own history. Ellen White comments upon this frequently. If you do a surface reading of this passage, you would think that at midnight the cry is made, and the cry and midnight become one event. They become a singular point, just as I've drawn it here. But what we've discovered, what we've found, what the Lord has revealed to us, is the closer that we get to this event here, and just to give you a scale, we're here today, 2016. We're not quite here at midnight. As we've approached, what we've realized is that these two terms, midnight and cry, are actually separate events. They're two separate events. So now we mark that at midnight there was a cry made. So this is the cry at midnight, or the midnight cry, which comes after midnight itself. Now you might think, well, that's a bit of a stretch of the imagination to do that, but it really isn't. Because if you go back into Millerite history, you can actually track these two waymarks precisely. And what I mean by precisely, I can give you the dates and the events that surround those dates where these two events were fulfilled. Just in the same way that we have October 22nd, 1844, just in the same way that we have August the 11th, 1840, we can track this to precisely the very day. Now, Brother Patrick explained to you how you get the date August 11th. You go back into history, 391 years, 15 days, then you go back another 150 years and you go to a history book. And that history book will tell you that on the 27th of July, I believe it's 27th of July, in the year 1299, there's an event that happens. It was recorded by a historian, and that's put down in the history book. And once that date is established, you can track forward all those many years and you get August 11th. That's how they calculate the date. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought or come to the realization, how do you work out that October 22nd, 1844 is the day of atonement? It's the day that Christ moves from one apartment to the... How do they know it's on that day? Not the 21st, not in September, not in November. Where did they get that number from? Because if you go back into biblical history, you know that this is on the 10th day of the 7th month. This is the language that's used in the Bible, the 10th day of the 7th month. And you know this is the 22nd day of the 10th month. So the 22nd of the 10th has got nothing to do with the 10th of the 7th, if we're going to use this coding for a calendar. So you can see we've got different calendars going on here. Now, the Millerites really had a sophisticated understanding of their message, and they developed their arguments and this date from a very sophisticated use of their own calendar and the Hebrew calendar. We're not discussing that here at the moment, but what I am pointing out is the following. If you go back into this history, I'm going to rub this off and just scale that up so we can get, for those of you at the back, you can see it a little bit clearer. Here we are, April 1844, and this is April the 19th, and here's the 22nd of October 1844. We've heard of New Year's Day, yeah? New Year's Day is January the 1st in our calendar. In the Millerite mind, if you could transport yourself back into Millerites and enter into someone's body, this would be New Year's Day. This is New Year's Day for the Millerite. So April the 18th is New Year's Eve. And this understanding, which many Adventists don't understand today, was the methodology that they used to calculate the 22nd of October. It was an understanding of this date here. And the way they calculated this date, and they knew that this was New Year's Day, was based upon the cycle of the moon, the cycle of the sun, and having an understanding how the Hebrews calculated their yearly cycles. So that's what they're using. Now, as they're going through their history, a number of events are occurring. And one of the most important events that occurs is right here in July. On July the 21st, 1844, July 21st, 1844, a person called Samuel Snow, who has already been in communication with the Holy Spirit, if I can put it that way, before this event, but now he's raised up to give a message to God's church, to these Millerites. And the message that he's going to give is that the bridegroom is about to return. In this period here, from April to July, the Millerites had lost track, had lost their understanding, their compass, their direction on when Christ was going to come. They thought he was going to come at the very latest by the 18th of April, New Year's Eve. They thought that would be the last point where Christ could ever come. And when you get to New Year's Day, all their hopes got destroyed, got crushed, and they had no idea what had gone wrong. Then the Lord raised up Samuel Snow with the answer. And by the time you get to July, Samuel Snow realizes what's gone wrong. And he's going to give a message, which is the message, "Behold, the bridegroom cometh." And where did he get that phrase from? It's taken directly out of this concept, or this model of marriage, from Matthew 25. This is the cry that's made at midnight when he arouses the virgins All of them are asleep, the wise and the foolish. And he says, everybody wake up because the bridegroom is here. And in the parable, that happens at midnight. So here we would mark midnight. And Ellen White confirms this. This is not something that we've developed. This is straight out of the spirit of prophecy and straight out of the writings of the pioneers. They recognized that this was midnight. And the way they did that calculation is that they would say that this was the beginning of a day. Let me try and do this a different way. You know that one day equals 1 year. 1 day equals 1 year. So half a day, here's half a day, equals half a year. Now 1 day is 24 hours. And half a day would be 12 hours. So if you think of half a day, and they would say that from April to October is half a day, it's 6 months, they worked out exactly what halfway would be from this date to this date. And they worked it out to the very day. And it was literally, the 21st of July was exactly halfway. And what they did was, they said, well, this is half a day, and if you go from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., which was the way the Jews would calculate their day, halfway into that would be midnight or 12 p.m. And they knew that when that event happened on the 21st of July, they were exactly halfway through this reform, this piece of the reform movement. So they calculated that this was midnight. There were very few people who actually took hold of this message, except the people that listened to his presentation. The following month, in August, there was a camp meeting, and on the 15th of August, Samuel Snow gave a second presentation of the same message that he'd given here. When he gave his second presentation on the 15th of August, this message was finally accepted, and his message was the message that the bridegroom is going to come. And this is why we would mark this as the cry that's given. So here's the cry, and it's connected to the events that refer to midnight. And both of these events, these dates, are all encoded in Bible prophecy to the very letter, to the very day. You can go back into Bible prophecy and you can work out what these days are. Because we already know this, don't we? This is the 10th day of the 7th month. We know that. You can go back and you can see that this is New Year's Day. And New Year's Day is what day of the year? It's the first day of the first month. And if you go back into the book of Ezekiel and the book of Ezra, you can see that these dates are also codified in the Bible. And this turns out to be the 5th day of the 4th month, and this is the 1st day of the 5th month. So all of these dates, these are our calendar, these are real life dates. April the 19th, July the 21st, August the 15th, October the 22nd, are all fulfillments of these biblical dates, the 1st of the 1st month, 10th of the 7th, and these two here, the 5th of the 4th, and the 1st of the 5th. But what I wanted to show you here was that often when we read the parable of the 10 virgins, we only think of it as a singular event. But the Millerites recognized July 21st as being midnight. If you ask most Adventist historians today, they would mark midnight cry as occurring in August on the 15th at the Exeter camp meeting, which was this camp meeting that we just spoke about. And what we are doing is identifying that both of these waymarks are correct. They both can be seen in Scripture. This one is from Ezekiel chapter 1, and this is from Ezra chapter 7. You can find both of these dates brought to view in the Scriptures, and these dates were prophetic symbols of the events that are happening in Millerite history. So the only reason I mention that is that these two waymarks become critical when we think about the sealing work of God's people at the end of the world. And we've developed these two, I haven't made them up, from the history that surrounds the events that occur in Millerite history as they fulfill their parable of the 10 virgins. And it's based upon the events of Samuel Snow and what he does at these two meetings. So that was a crash course in Midnight and Midnight Cry. And normally when we do a presentation on this, it will take a couple of hours to run through all of that. So if you've been able to follow along with this and you're new, you've done really well. So hopefully you've got that. Is that okay to rub it off? Not yet? Okay, I'll leave that on then. So we've got 1989, 9/11, Midnight and Midnight Cry. And then we've got the one that we're all familiar with, the Sunday Law. I've identified what the Sunday Law is. This is the Sunday Law in the United States. We're pinpointing it with that definition in the United States, where they first legislate that you are now going to have to break Sabbath. And as I said before, they can make you break Sabbath in many ways. They don't have to force you to go to work. If the government says the dustbin men, do you call them the refuse men? I don't know what you call them in the garbage men. Because the economy is collapsing, we can no longer afford to have garbage men. So everyone has to clean up their communities, and we're not going to do that on a weekday because most people are at work, and Sunday is the day that the family needs to gather together. So, we're going to do it on Saturday. So on Saturday, everybody has to go around the community picking up all the garbage that's been strewn over everywhere, and it's a community requirement. You do it free of charge, there's no cost, but everybody has to be involved. And if you don't, you're not being community minded. However way you look at that, getting involved in that kind of activity where the state imposes something that you have to do on a Saturday is breaking Sabbath, even though there's no money exchange being involved in this issue. So we need to broaden our understanding of how you break Sabbath. Don't think that the government's going to force every one of you to say you now have to go. If you're self-employed and you're a decorator, they're not going to make you go and do decorating on Sabbath. No one's going to force you to do that. The enforcement to break Sabbath is going to be a lot more subtle. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about the Sunday Law. And then our last one is the close of probation. And this close of probation, I just want to put the term here, general. And what I mean by that is that this is the close of probation once every human being's case has been decided. Everyone has been sorted out. And this is Daniel 12:1. This is when Michael stands up. This is when Christ stands up from his ministration, and the symbol of standing up means a change in dispensation or a change in job function. Now Christ is going to stand up, walk out of the sanctuary, take his garments off, the garments of priesthood, and now he's going to put the garments of kingship on, and he's no longer going to minister in the most holy place for anybody. And so if you do sin after this stage here, there's no mechanism of being justified. You cannot have your sins dealt with when there's no high priest to deal with them any longer. And so this is where we mark the close of probation. Nobody's case can be dealt with or sought out after that period. So these are our 6 waymarks. And it took a while to just lay those out because these 2 are the ones that many of us are unfamiliar with. I realise the 1989 and 9/11 have their own challenges, and many people don't see the relationship, especially about 9/11, when it comes to the judgment of the living or the sealing of God's people. But I think this passage from Testimonies to Ministers is a really strong and powerful argument to defend the truthfulness of what we say, that it's here at 9/11 when Islam begins to make its presence known in the world, when the nations begin to become angry that begins or marks the sealing. There are other events that are occurring here. It's not just that one event, but that's a really easy one to see. So I'm familiar that these two people may be uncomfortable with, but I was focusing on midnight to midnight cry, and I've shown you the argument or the logic why we're going to make these as two separate waymarks, not a singular one. And then with the Sunday law that we already know, and then the close of probation. You'll remember that this midnight cry is something that Brother Patrick brought up, both in the Reformed line of Christ, when he spoke about... actually, no, he didn't speak about that. He just spoke about it, I think, in the history of the Millerites. So I'll just leave it at that stage there. So I'm going to rub this off now, and we're going to make application to the passage that we just read from early writings. So it says to hold back or restrain these winds, and it marks them being 4 times. Now we've already said, after the third step here, when everything's been sealed, then the winds are going to be let loose. That's when the punishment happens. You can see that this is the close of probation. So right here, now everything from this point here is going to be loosed. This is the loosening of the winds. So we've marked that point. And now we've got these 4 holes to deal with. So the 4 holes are being marked here. Hold, 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 and hold. And what's being portrayed here is that we're beginning to see a progressive sealing work that's going on. You can see by this stage, everybody has been sealed. So here would be this number 3. I realise that here I've marked it as a Sunday law, but it's close of probation in this context. When you've reached the number 3, everybody's been sealed and the winds are going to be let loose. But you can begin to see that the reason why they're saying hold at these steps is because the winds are desperately trying to escape and be let loose and cause ravage upon the earth. And they're fulfilling that work to a degree. So there's a restraining here because these winds want to do something, and then there's going to be another one and another one. And what we're going to find is that these holds, or this releasing of the winds of this progressive nature, begins to escalate. So here we've got it marked as 9/11. Here, political strife, radical Islam, began to make the nations angry, and they pretty much devastated the economy of the world. Everything's just being patched up at the moment, and all they did, and I don't mean this in any kind of a disrespectful way, they only went into one city in the United States and destroyed 2 buildings. Now, obviously for the people involved in that, it was a tragic thing. But in the scale of, say, the Second World War or the First World War, it wasn't that dramatic or large an event. It was a relatively small event, but it sent shockwaves in the world's economy. So if that's what happened here, when we come to midnight, we're expecting another interaction in a really strong way between radical Islam and the West, and we're saying that they're going to make another attack upon the United States, and then it's going to be repeated here and here, and as we get right to the end, now we've got to the stage where the winds are being loose. So this is this progressive restraining of radical Islam, and it's connected to the sealing. And what we're going to see as we develop this argument is that the sealing of God's people is going to be occurring in this time period. So we've already identified that it begins here at 9/11. So you know that this is here where the sealing begins. So what we're going to identify is these 3 groups. We've got them here. 1, 2, 3. First Adventism, then the world, and we're going to see how these groups are going to be restrained. You can see how I've marked it here. The Sunday law, close of probation, this is number 3. And here, you're going to have 1 and 2. You're going to have these 2 steps or these two portions of Adventism that are going to be sealed. And we're going to see how this sealing work progresses through this history, and we're going to identify, only in the prophetic sense or a symbolic sense, why we're identifying that there are these two groups. So we've just read Early Writings, page 38, paragraph 1. It talks about these four holes as the sealing work of God's people begins to take its effect in this movement. In the next paragraph, a truth that you must settle into. So now we're going to define what the sealing is. This is a definition of the sealing. For Bible Commentary 1161, paragraph 6. Just as soon as the people of God are sealed in their foreheads, it is not any seal or mark that can be seen, but a settling into the truth, both intellectually and spiritually, so that they cannot be moved. Just as soon as God's people are sealed and prepared for the shaking, it will come. Indeed, it has begun already. The judgments of God are now upon the land to give us warning, that we may know what is coming. So now she's going to define what the sealing is. The sealing from 9/11 to this event here, in this story as we've got it here, for Adventism, is a settling into truth. You're being sealed, you're in a sealing process, you're settling into truth. Now the truth that's being discussed here, there are many truths in Adventism, but it's present truth that the flock needs now. And this present truth is the truth of this cry that's being given here at 9/11, that the judgment of the living has begun, and that probation's about to close sooner than you had thought or realized. That's what this truth is. That's what this message is all about. It's to give you the identification that these two events, the time of the end and the empowerment of the first message, has arrived, and that judgment is about to occur in short order. That's essentially what this truth is. And it's symbolized by the eating of the book of Revelation 10, the eating of the scroll of Ezekiel 2 and 3, the unsealing of this scroll which has got 7 seals on it in Revelation 5. It's the eating of Christ of John chapter 6. It's the eating of the manna in the book of Exodus. They're all symbols of what this truth is. Let me spell settle correctly. So, the sealing is a settling into the truth. Now, the other component about this truth, it says it must be done intellectually and spiritually. If we had time, and I know we're not going to have time, but we would really want to develop this concept or this idea about the intellectual and the spiritual component of a human being, because this is dealing with mind, and this is dealing with what I'm going to be calling heart. So this is introducing the concept of the mind and the heart, and the third component in the nature of a human being is will. You know, our physical bodies is not what makes us human beings. If you were in a car accident and you lost your legs, or you lost your arms, or if you lost all your limbs, you'd still be the same person, wouldn't you? You know that your physical body is not you. You are housed in a physical body. So everything that you see, your fingers, your toes, your limbs, your stomach, all of this is not you. Because you can live perfectly well, have the same memories, have everything. If you had your stomach taken out, your bowels taken out, most of your body organs could be removed and you'd still be the same person. A human being is not the physical house that you see. It's what's inside that house. And the human being is composed of 3 components. It's composed of will, mind, and heart. Ellen White uses this threefold nature of the human being and says our primary goal, the primary goal of education, is to understand yourself. And to understand yourself, you need to understand the threefold nature of a human being. And to understand what your nature is, because we all understand we're under sinful nature, you need to understand what happened when Adam fell, which is related to his nature. But I only mentioned all of that because these are important things that you need to understand, because it's been introduced that the settling into the truth, this message that you need to prepare for this third event, that you're going to be sealed, based upon the events that are occurring outside of your control, 1989, 9/11, midnight cry, then the Sunday law. This truth has an impact upon your mind and upon your heart. And the way you respond to this is vitally important. You cannot just have an intellectual assent to the truth, you have to have a spiritual experience. So I'm not going to spend any more time developing that idea, but it's a study that each of us need to really get to grips with. So it says that you need to settle into this truth until you get to stage 3. By the time you get to stage 3, you're now firm in your position, one way or the other. You're either firm in your position to be wise or foolish, one of the two. So it says here, the truth that's going to impact you has to impact you intellectually and spiritually, so that you cannot be moved when you get to this stage. When you cannot be moved, the Lord looks upon you and says, you know, if we went through this for another 5 years or 10 years or 50 years or 100 years, if you live long enough, you wouldn't change. Whatever more information I give you, whatever new revelation I give you, nothing will change. He recognizes that in a human being, not only individually, but also as this corporate group or this church, our church. He comes to a position, he says, these events are demonstrating that this person is never going to change after this. And that's what it says here. So the person sealed and prepared, it says, so they cannot be moved. Then it says this, just as soon as God's people are sealed, right here, it says that the shaking will come. So, first of all, we had the symbol of indignation or punishment, and now it's the shaking. The shaking takes many guises. It's a symbol that represents a number of different things, but one of the things it represents is the political strife that's going on in the world that's going to be used to punish this wicked world, and Adventism. So that's what the shaking is. And then she says, indeed, it has already begun. So if the shaking is going to happen here, and we read the shaking can only happen once God's people are sealed, here it is, fully loosed, why would she say, before this has happened, before the sealing has already occurred, it says, indeed, the shaking has already begun. Here we are, 9/11, it begins the sealing work. And what she's identifying is when the sealing begins, long before it ever finishes here, that this shaking, which I'm going to mark here, the winds are loose, here's the shaking, has already begun right here. And what does the shaking look like? It looks like the struggle or the warfare between the West and radical Islam, which began on 9/11. Now this struggle actually began years before this, but we picked 9/11 as the waymark that shaped modern history. Our world, everybody's worldview has been shaped by the events of 9/11, and the repercussions are still going on. This marks the shaking that's already begun, and that's what Ellen White is referring to here. She says, indeed it has begun already in the judgments of God that are now upon the land, to give us warning of what is coming. So if you think 9/11 was bad, wait till you see when it's fully loosed here. But before we get to that stage, you wait and see as Islam progressively begins to be released, as God's people are sealed through this movement, and the impact it's going to have upon us. So we're not going to read through the next three passages. What's being dealt with in the next passages, the Signs of the Times article and the Great Controversy articles, are basically dealing with the judgment that she's speaking about here. She says, indeed, it has begun already. The judgments of God are now in the land. And when she's referring to these judgments, they're not just political strife, which is the thing that we focus on, the work of radical Islam, but it's also nature is convulsing. And these statements here talk about the convulsion of nature. And she's going to tell you that the power that's behind this convulsion is not God. God is not destroying nature and using it as a weapon against humanity. What he's doing is he's withdrawing his spirit. And as he withdraws his spirit, Satan fills the vacuum, and his purpose is to kill and destroy people. He just does not like us. And when he's given a free rein, he'll kill people. You saw that in the story of the demoniacs. When they were forced to leave those two men, they wanted to go into the pigs just to cause more trouble. That's what Satan's purpose is. If he's given leeway, he'll just come and cause death and destruction. And that's what these passages are talking about. So we're on page 7 now, and we're in Matthew 13, verses 24 to 30. The wheat and the tares. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up, and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, this not thou sow good seed in the field? From whence then hath it tares? He said unto them, An enemy has done this. The servant said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles, and burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. So we're going to kind of start backward in this parable. It identifies the time of the harvest, and it says, when the time of the harvest comes, he's going to say to the reapers, you need to gather together first the tares and bind them into bundles. So you're going to go into the field, you're going to get those tares and you're going to cut them down, and you're going to separate them from the wheat. So here is this process at the very end, where now this separation process is coming. Remember the very first passage that we read, it's on page 2, which was, not page 2, it's page 5, which was the early writing statement. It says, Then I saw the third angel, said my companion angel, Fearful is his work, awful is his mission. He is the angel that is to select the wheat from the tares, and seal or bind the wheat for the heavenly garner. So I should have put here, I've missed it, which is why I couldn't see it. It says select, which means separate. So the separation of these two groups, the wheat and the tares, that we're talking about in Matthew 13, verse 30, happens at the very end. And who does that work? It's the third angel that does this work of selecting and separating. But here it uses the symbol of reapers. So the third angel is a reaper who will separate or select the wheat from the tares. And now we have some kind of order, because it says in this passage, first the tares, first the tares, and then second or last the wheat. And this is these two waymarks that I'm picking up here. As I said, it's a bit more complicated than just these two waymarks, but I'm going to pick these two up here, and I'm going to say first the tares and then the wheat. That's what I want to pick these two waymarks as. The tares are dealt with first, and then the wheat are dealt with in this period of the third angel. So you can see the work of the third angel has got many symbols attached to it, and it does a work that takes a period of time, and there's an order to the events. First the tares, then the wheat. And it tells you what's going to happen to them. They're going to get bound into bundles, and they're going to be burnt by this destruction that's going to go on here. And then it says, gather the wheat into my barn. This is this refuge that we spoke about. So this barn that's being spoken of is this seal that's being applied to them at the level that we're discussing. Obviously, eventually, this barn is a heavenly barn that we read earlier, which is that your rite of passage to get into heaven. So way back here, by the time you get to the second advent, if you were going to apply this passage all the way down to there, this heavenly barn is the saints that are going to go to heaven. But in this context here, this refuge, this place of shelter or safety, is the seal that you have during this time period when these tares are going to be burnt. What we see in this passage is that the separation occurs at the third step, and it doesn't occur during this process here. Now, if we just go back to verse 25, it says, but while men slept. Now, this sleeping, we're going to put it here, and we're going to connect the sleeping to Matthew 25. Because in Matthew 25, the virgins go to sleep while they're tarrying, waiting for this information or this light that they realize when Christ is about to return. So as you begin this development of light and truth, you begin with people who are asleep. So that's another marker of 9/11. And then while they sleep, an enemy introduces tares into this reformatory movement. So this is this concept that you have the wise and the foolish, which are the wheat and the tares. It's these two groups in Adventism that are going to be tested, and they walk together during this journey all the way until you get to the third waymark, and then they're going to be separated. That's what is being taught here. We'll skip through Second Thessalonians. We could make some application there. And all that's being taught in this passage is that once you get to this stage and these two groups are separated, don't think that these tares or these foolish virgins are going to wake up and say, oh, I realised I'm a really bad person. Dear me, I wonder what I should do to change. No, what's actually going to happen is when they get to this stage and they're cut loose from the wheat and there's this separation, they're going to look to the wheat and they're going to say, you are the bad guys and we're the good people. And the wheat are going to say, actually it's the other way around. We're the good ones and you're the bad ones. And there's going to be this clash between these two groups. And the reason why the foolish or the tares are going to come to this decision here is brought to view in 2 Thessalonians is because they're going to come under strong delusion. They're going to think that everything is right when everything is wrong. This is this strong delusion that's brought to view in 2 Thessalonians that these people are going to experience. And they were experiencing it gradually all the way through here, but it's really going to come to fruition at the third step. Just one more point we want to bring to view here is first Adventism, then the world. First we judge God's people, and then the world will be judged. Now, the reason why it's important to understand that is because, it's always dangerous to give an example where you start putting some dates in, because people walk away thinking, this person said these things are going to happen at these certain times. So, here we are today. Let's go to 9/11, and this happened on day number 1. And here we are at the Sunday law, and this happened on day 15, and here we have close of probation, which happened on day 20. And here we are today, and it's day 12. So today we've got 3 days left before we are going to have our probation closed, because this is the story from here to here of Adventism. And this is the story for the world. The Lord is looking at his people, and he says, first we need to deal with the people. And the reason why he needs to deal with the people first, his people, is because who on earth is going to go and give a message to the world if these people aren't going to do it? Because there's no one left. If there weren't any Adventists, who's going to speak to these people in the world? Because those angels are a representation or a symbol of God's people. So he needs to get his people ready first. So we've got 3 days to get ready. Now, there's not a lot of work that you can do in 3 days if you've got 7 billion people to deal with. But if you've only got about whatever number we're at the moment, 14, 18 million Adventists, it's a much more manageable task that you can do in a short amount of time. So our focus and our attention should be on giving this message of warning that probation's about to close to Adventists first. Talk to your brothers and sisters first before worrying about your neighbours who are in the world, because they've got another 5 days afterwards, after your 3 days, so they've got 8 days left before they need to be sorted out. So there's plenty of time for them. So let's get things done in order. Now, God is a God of order. And he's told us this when he talks about judgment first beginning in the house of God and in the world. Everyone in the world follows this idea and this principle. This is nothing new, nothing strange. That you deal with the most pressing issues first and deal with the less important ones afterwards. Let's read Luke chapter 21, verse 21. It's in your notes. And we'll just read this and then we'll close. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein too. Now, if you know the context or the backdrop of Luke 21:21, it shouldn't have escaped your attention that this is only 4 verses before verse 25. So you know that this story has to have something to do with this sealing work. Now, I'm not suggesting it's got anything to do with the distress of nation, because this is a different symbol, but the story is the same story and it's happening at the same time. Now, if you go back into the history that's being dealt with in this passage, we're in the time of Christ. Christ has died, he's been crucified, resurrected, AD 34 has happened, so here's 34, here's the cross, and here's 27. And in God's mercy, he let time continue until the year AD 66 and then the year AD 70. There's many things that we could talk about this, but as Adventists, we know the history that surrounds the destruction of Jerusalem. This was at least the 3rd time that this event had happened. The first time it happened was with Nebuchadnezzar. The second time it happened was with General Pompey. And then the 3rd time it happened, this besiegement, was here in this period. And you know that the armies of Rome surround Jerusalem in the year AD 66. And for some unknown reason, they end up abandoning the siege and walking away. And the Jews see this as a sign. And it certainly is a sign. And they see this as a sign that they're now going to defeat the Romans. So they go out and they have a little fight with the Romans, and they beat them and they jeer them as the Romans are running away. They come back into Jerusalem content that now they're secure and end time prophecy is going to be fulfilled, and they're going to be the rulers of the world, and Jerusalem's going to be the centre. Little do they realise that 3.5 years later, in AD 70, Rome is going to come back and it's going to repeat the same event, and this time Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. So the thing that we want to mark here is that AD 66 and AD 70 are the same event. You remember when Brother Patrick was talking about the arrival of the first and its empowerment here, and he took you to the story of the three decrees. He took you to the 1st year of Cyrus and the 3rd year of Cyrus. He said these things are connected and are, in one sense, they're the same thing because it's dealing with the same king. It's just dealing with a different aspect of his rulership. But at one level, they're the same. And I'm saying the very similar thing here, that AD 66 and AD 70 are the same event, because this is the besieging of Jerusalem, and so is this. And Christ says, it doesn't say in Luke 21, it says it in the verses before that. It says, when you see this sign, then you should flee Jerusalem and escape for your life. But the problem is, when you see your city, and you live here in the city, and you see it ring-fenced by Rome, so you've seen the sign, how on earth are you going to escape? You can't escape. So at that level, the sign is meaningless. But what is connected to this sign is that they leave. And when you see that they leave, that is the code or the symbol for you to escape and flee. It says it here, let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out. The midst of it is talking about Jerusalem. If you're in Jerusalem, depart out of Jerusalem. If you're in Judea, here's Judea. Judea is a country. Jerusalem is in the middle of it. If you're in Judea, you need to leave and flee to the mountain. And if you're in Jerusalem, I'll put him headed in the same direction, because he would probably go in the same place. So here's this person. If you're in the countryside, in Judea, you leave. If you're in Jerusalem, you leave. So everybody's fleeing this place. And you're supposed to do it in this time period between 66 and 70. Because this is the proof. It's the proof that Jerusalem is about to be destroyed. Remember, we spoke about the relationship between the arrival and the empowerment, and I said this was the assumption, and this was the proof. The proof that Adventism has been given by God that the Sunday law is about to happen was 9/11. And you can mark, not just in this vague way that I'm doing it, you can mark accurately that 9/11 is AD 66 all over again. 9/11 is 86. And when you see this sign, the sign of 9/11, then you should know that the Sunday law is about to occur. And there's many, many truths that we could add into this, but I'm not giving you the evidence of this just because of lack of time. So as you see the evidence that's being brought to view here, you're supposed to flee from Jerusalem. And what is the symbol of Jerusalem at the end of the world? It's God's church, the Seventh-day Adventist church. So when you see this sign, Scripture teaches us that you need to flee from Adventism. Now, this is not literal, this is symbolic. And the fleeing of Adventism is not that you leave and move your body out of a conference church and you go and set up another church and hire a hall and do your own thing. That's not what the separation or the leaving of Jerusalem is. It's leaving all the doctrines, all the false ideology that's going on in this church, which has been developing way back since 1850, and all the errors that have been introduced, and there are many, many errors on many, many fronts. You need to depart from those errors. A nice way of expressing this is that the sins of our fathers we need to separate from. We're the children of our fathers, and we must stop committing the same sins that they did. And in departing from those sins is being symbolized in this passage by fleeing from Jerusalem. It's fleeing from all the false doctrines that now reside in our church. So that's all clear and that's all good. But then it introduces some other idea. It says that there's another country outside here. All of this is a symbol of the Seventh-day Adventist church. And then it says, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. So here are the countries. And these countries are a symbol of Babylon. So when you see the sign of AD 66, when you see the towers in New York being brought down at 9/11, the first thing you should begin to do is realize we're now at the end of the world and the Sunday law is about to happen. And we've only got this short amount of time. From 9/11, I showed you it was 15 days. You've got 15 days to get ready. The world has got plenty of time afterwards, so don't focus upon them. Focus upon your own brothers and sisters in the church, because this is the group that's going to be judged first. And what we should realize, according to Luke 21:21, is that we're supposed to flee from all the doctrines that are wrong in the church. And what we should not be doing is getting people who are in Babylon and telling them to come into Jerusalem to join us in a place that is no longer safe and is a dysfunctional organization. This is not the place that we should be telling people to come into, because this place is about to be destroyed in 3.5 years. This whole concept is really easy to see in this passage, and it's a call to not focus upon bringing people in the world here and drawing them into our church. The phraseology that we use is public evangelism. It's a futile exercise to tell people in the world to come and become Adventists when Adventism is about to be destroyed and punished. So this passage is just a really encapsulated story that warns us that when you see the sign of 9/11, our focus and attention should be about personal preparation, preparing your family, your friends, and your brothers and sisters in the church, because destruction is about to happen 3.5 years' time in AD 70. If this is AD 66, this is AD 70. And in this time period, the people who are living in Babylon, it's not really sensible or wise for them to come and join our church. So we should hold back in trying to encourage them to join us, because their salvation is left for another period. We've got this progressive sealing, the first step, the second and the third step. This is when we're going to be calling God's people out of Babylon. This is Revelation chapter 18 verse 4, which we're familiar with. It's the loud cry, it's the call under the latter rain that says, "Come out of her, Babylon, my people." In the meantime, we should be dealing with the judgment of God's people and not trying to get the world into the mess that we're already in, that we're trying to escape out of. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your watch care over your people. We know, Lord, that you've had the plan of salvation worked out before the foundations of the world were created. Help us, Lord, to understand your will. It seems to be a recurring theme, Father, that everybody seems to know what's going on except your people. For some reason, we seem to be blinded by our pride, our ambition, our desire for materialism, to not understand the times in which we're living. Father, as we consider these important subjects, it's my prayer that both myself, my family, my brothers and sisters would see these things for what they are, a call to prepare for the coming destruction and the great loss of life that's going to occur in this church. Father, if we had a love for our parents, our children, our friends and our brothers and sisters, we would bend our energies to warn them and to show them these things so that they too can prepare. Father, the gospel that saves us must be the gospel that we give to others to be saved. Help us, Lord, to realize the truthfulness of this message so that we can share it in verity and with conviction to our loved ones. Is our prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen.